It looks good on my end.
My,
Now that we actually have levels coming through.
yeah, we're good. We're
Okay. All right. Cool. Let's start again. So, episode 2 of Beer School. Same deal. No, 100% all around. All right. So, this week,
See.
this week, Pilsners. It is the most widely brewed beer style in the world, most widely consumed style of beer in the world, and we are joined this week again by Chewy, all the way out in California. Say hi, Chewy.
Hello.
Variety caster and affiliate, and inching ever closer towards partnerdom. We have emotes on the way in Chewy's community. And joining us from Quebec is Giggle.
Hey.
Giggle, what kind of stuff do you normally stream?
Mainly, well, nothing interesting to be honest. Like I'm usually
Like getting
streaming
good
when
stuff.
it's very much too late. I'm completely wasted. I don't use my mic and my webcam, and that's it. That's what I do.
Sounds like the best kind of streams. You should all follow this
Yeah.
man.
Worst streamer, NA.
Well, I'm extremely glad that you were able to join me, and I think this is going to be really cool. So, anybody out in chat that wants to follow along, we're going to be using an app called Draft Lab. It's DRAUGHTLAB. You can download it from the App Store or from Google Play, and we'll use that to aggregate our evaluations of these beers. So, let's do a little quick history of Pilsner. Like I said, it is the most widely produced style of beer in the world right now, and it has been since its inception in the mid 1800s. Pilsner comes from the city in the Czech Republic called Pilsen, and let me pull up a little map here for us. There we go. So we've got the Czech Republic, surrounded by Germany, Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Austria. Prague is right there in the middle, and then Pilsen is down here on the side. And let me just read you a little bit of history here. So, 1838, the brewers in the Czech Republic were in Pilsen specifically were having all kinds of problems with their beer. This is still before anybody knew anything about what yeast really was or microbiology, and although they had been brewing beer for like 800 years in Pilsen, they're still having all these issues. So what they ended up doing was bringing a Bavarian brewer. So if we scroll over just a little bit here, Bavaria is the southern region of Munich, or of Germany, with Munich right in the middle. So right about this whole circle right here. So you can see pretty close. But Germany has this long tradition of making lager style beers, and lager, like we said last week, is the German word to store. So Germans would make beers and store them in these caves, and they would age for a long time, and the yeast in those in that beer ended up working really well at cool temperatures, and they would age in these cold or cool, relatively cool caves, and from using that yeast over and over again, they basically came up with the lager yeast fork of the yeast tree. Ales being kind of the English tradition, and lagers being the more German tradition. So they're having problems brewing beer in Pilsen in the mid 1800s. They bring this Bavarian brewer named Joseph Groll, and he brought his lagering method to Pilsen. And there's also a story that a monk snuck some of this lager yeast out of Bavaria and brought it to Pilsen so that they could make this beer. And Pilsen had some really great things going for it in terms of making beer, because they have this really nice soft water. They have amazing barley that they grow in the region in Moravia, and then they have these hops called Zatz hops that are really spicy and super nice. And so they a couple really, what I think are really cool things are happening all about the same time in the mid 1800s. Number one, they figure out a way to make clear glass, which is pretty cool. And with making clear glass, they're making all kinds of instruments like thermometers. And when you start adding up all of these little inventions, you kind of come up with this like perfect storm for making Pilsner. So Joseph Grohl brings this yeast, and he makes a really light colored beer that is like golden. And this is pretty novel up until now, because beer up until this point has almost always been either smoky or have some type of roasted malt in it, and it ended up being dark, and it was often consumed in some kind of stoneware, so you couldn't see it unless you were pouring it out, but it was almost always dark colored, because like we talked about last week, when you make malted barley, you need to add heat to... All right, thank you for the follow, Jay. You need to add heat to the malted barley after the germination process to remove all that water so that you can turn that into malt. And that heat source in the mid-1800s is going to be some kind of fire. And if you're going to have some kind of fire cooling or taking the water out of your malt, you're adding smoke to it, just like when you're making barbecue or something like that. So when they started using coke fires and blowing the hot air over the malt, it didn't add that smoky character, so they get a really pale colored malt, and it tastes just like barley instead of smoke or whatever else you're using from your fire source. So adding that to the super soft water of the Pilsen area, they get to have this pale colored beer, and it's super unique. They don't have anything like this anywhere else in the world, and it immediately catches on. It's super popular the world over. It gets translated back into Germany, and they make Pilsner style beers there. They make beers from exported out of Dortmund, which is a similar style to Pilsner, and then basically it just it goes all around the world. It's light, it's refreshing, it's crisp, and it has, in some ways, kind of a bad name now, because it's the macro brews of the world now, right? It's just industrial lager. What they have come to be brewed now are often nearly flavorless beers that are made with usually some type of adjunct. So something that's not just all barley. Either corn or rice is often added to lighten the flavor instead of an all malt beer. So to me, I think it's just a super cool little bit of brewing history where you have all of these things coming together to make a totally unique style of beer, and obviously it's still super popular today. So let's. I wanted to show you guys a couple couple more things. Let's go to. There is a documentary series that was created in the 1980s by a guy named Michael Jackson, who was a super famous beer writer and whiskey writer. He was an English guy, and he made this 3-part documentary series called The Beer Hunter, and he goes all around the world and explores different kinds of beers, but he has an entire episode dedicated to the beers of Bohemia. And specifically, he goes to the Pilsner Urquell brewery, and he goes to the original Budweiser brewery. And I'm just going to hit play on some of this footage, and we can see it. And tell me this doesn't look like straight out of a PlayerUnknown Battlegrounds map. Like, he's walking around, and the church is there. They're going to show some footage of the brewery, and you see the giant Soviet stars, and there's a big hammer and sickle that's coming up too. And I thought this was just so perfect to check out. But Pilsner Urquell is the very first Pilsner brewery. And let's see, Chewy, you were able to get Pilsner Urquell?
Yes, I
okay.
was.
But Giggle, you said no Pilsner Urquell in Quebec.
Not right now. They're
Okay.
completely. They decided not to go and renew with them.
So one of the challenges of having an international beer school, of course, is that I thought I was picking beers that everybody was going to be able to get a hand, to pick up without too much trouble. But it turns out that nope, it was actually not super easy. So we're going to do our best here. But let's do this first beer real quick, and just as a caveat, or an explanation. the way that we describe beers and the way that I describe beers, even if it's something that you decide that you really don't like, it's not like, oh, this beer is shitty. Like, even if it has some kind of awful fault in it, we're going to work to describe the fault, not just like, oh, this is a trash beer. Or maybe it's just a beer that you don't like. But there are literally thousands and thousands of beers in the world. So it's okay if you don't like a beer, but it's not okay just to dismiss it if you don't have the ways to describe what you don't like about it. So...
Sure. So we'll be finding the carrots in the shit, right? The little pieces left.
Maybe. We'll see if...
Digested, yeah. Okay.
All right. So this first beer, Pilsner Urquell, this is, like I said, this is a beer they've been making since 1842. These are actually some like special edition cans that they're putting out. But let's see if they have a date on here. Looks like November 27th, 2017 is, I think it is their best buy date. Not everybody labels their beers in the same way, and it can be confusing if you don't know what is listed on the can. But this is from the original Pilsner brewery. Urquell means from the source. And in German, if you're going around, you'll often see hotels and stuff that say like Zurquella or Zumkeller, and that will mean like it's at the source of a river, or it's from the source. So I'm going to pour just a little bit of this beer. We're not going to go through all of these beers on stream. I'm going to enjoy these later, but I mean, I can't drink 4 or 5 tall boys in the course of this stream. But so we're going to pour a little bit of this out, and we're going to go through the way that we evaluate this. Let me open up Draft Lab while we're at it, and I will show you guys what Draft Lab is all about. So. This is what I think is a super cool program. We use this at work. We use the pro version of this to do stuff at work. It is a piece of software that was created by one of my friends at New Belgium, actually, and some other people. And it's a different way of evaluating beers. So I'm going to go to Add Tasters here. So if you guys have this app open, let me see if this will pull up.
Is there a code?
Yeah, I'm gonna generate the code right now.
Oh, okay.
And so we should all be able to log into the same one. View code. All right, so the code is 1SX40. So you guys can plug that into your app, and chat. Anybody else that's joining us can plug that one into
1SX40.
Yeah, and you should be able to see that on the screen.
Okay.
Thank you, Giggle, for the assist. All right, so the way this works, it's pretty straightforward, and I've used this for beer schools in real life with some other people too. It's a pretty intuitive piece of software or app to use. So as we go through here, we'll evaluate the beers, and I'll talk about all the different aspects of it, and then we can describe what we're tasting and smelling, and talk about what we think is good or not as good. And then we'll keep our samples, and we'll go back and try them in context of the other beers that we've already had. Because for me, it's very difficult to have a beer like in vacuum, essentially. You have your first beer and everything's kind of based off of that, and then you go back and you try some other stuff and see like, oh, well, I didn't taste that originally, but as you come back, you might taste some different stuff. So let me go back to this real quick. All right, so if I hold this up, this is a very pale colored beer, and my green screen's not going to like it very much, but all of these beers should be golden and extremely bright. There shouldn't be any haze, and they should be very brilliant in color. So as we go back to our app and work through all of these different characteristics. So color, if you click on color, you have this really cool slider bar, and you can actually hold it right up next to your glass and look and see what you think the color matches with. And so for me, this is kind of a dark yellow maybe, or light straw is extremely pale. Like that's like maybe an American light beer, which maybe if we get to Labatt Blue later, that'll be a little bit more accurate. So I think it's going to fall somewhere on that early side of dark yellow for me, but you guys can decide what it looks like for you, because this is going to aggregate all of our evaluations together. So haze,
Go on. Look more a little light orange on my end, but
yeah, that's whatever you think is accurate for you, because we'll put these will all come together for us. So haze for me, this is extremely clear. Particulate size, I don't see any particulate. This is a super bright beer, so there's not even anything on the scale for me there. Foam, if you give this beer a little bit of a swirl, and let's see what the head looks like. Let me go back. Can we get a little bit? For me, that's an extremely white foam.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. Lacing, as we do some samples, we can come back and see if there's any lacing on the glass. Lacing also is dependent on how clean your glassware is, in addition to the manufacturing or the brewing of the beer. So aromas, this is our first major category here. So if you click on the Add Aroma button, you're going to see all of these different categories, basically, of what of kind of like mother categories for where your different aromas are going to come from. So I mentioned that Pilsners are made primarily with noble hops, which are either Zads from the Czech Republic or a couple other different varieties from Germany, but they typically have herbal or spicy characteristics, which have become known as the noble varieties of hops. So when we're evaluating beers, we have a sensory manager at work her primary job is to go around and to taste beers all day long, and to make sure that the beers that we're making are to spec, and also to do employee education. So we do regular sensory training at work on off flavors, and we drink all of our beers, and we check to make sure that what we're making matches what our benchmarks are. So you can get extremely detailed about your beer sampling, or you can be a little bit more casual with it. There's nothing wrong with the way that you do it. And then the other really important thing to remember that I always tell people in beer tastings is that taste is totally subjective. So there's no right and there's no wrong. And just because you taste or smell something does not mean, if somebody doesn't, that it's wrong. It just means that that's what you get out of the beer. So the way that we evaluate beers at work, if we're really doing the super detailed version of it, is to take your glass and the first thing we do for aroma is what they call the drive-by. So you just kind of move it by your nose and do a quick sniff and see if there's anything that jumps at you right away. So to me, on that aroma, I get a little bit of a graininess and a little bit of breadiness and a little bit of sulfur character too. Sulfur is produced by lager yeasts, super normal for that. And then give your glass a little bit of a swirl, like 1 or 2 swirls. Thanks, Jay. I appreciate it. Make sure to hang around, and we're going to go through a couple of beers. So give your glass a little bit of a swirl and do a couple short, quick sniffs. And the reason that's important to do short, quick sniffs is because your sinuses actually will be totally overwhelmed if you just keep breathing in and breathing in and breathing in. So if you do a couple of short, quick sniffs, you can get an idea of what it is, and then do another swirl and really do a really long swirl and see if that's any different. And what kind of things are you guys smelling in here? Actually, let's go back to the app real quick. And let's see, what do you guys, if we go through these lists, I think I would get maybe a little bit of, let's see, sweet aromatic. I don't think I get that one so much. What's in grassy? Fresh cut grass. Maybe a little bit of hay. Herbaceous. No.
There's definitely something pungent jumping at me, but I'm not really sure how to explain what it is.
Okay.
It's like sweet but not sweet.
Let's click through on a couple of these on a couple of these different categories and see if you can find a more accurate descriptor in one of the subcategories. So let's see, maybe.
It does kind of have that like honey sweetness. It's not overtly, but
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I could see honey. Um,
it's got
probably.
that kind of musty. I don't know.
Let's see, what's under earthy? Barnyard moss, soil mold, musty, mushroom. There, I mean, you under earthy, you can put musty if you feel like you're getting musty out of it.
I personally went into fruity and then melon
Okay.
and added the honeydew.
Okay.
Mm.
That's what I'm sensing.
Yeah, more honeydew than honey. Sure.
And like I
Sure.
said, there's no wrong answers. It's what you're getting out of the beer. So don't, if you get something that you think somebody somebody else doesn't get, that's not a problem. That's not
Oh no.
wrong. And then also another really important part about evaluating and doing sensory on beers is that not everybody has the same receptors. So like there's a chemical component in some beers like Rolling Rock called DMS, which is dimethyl sulfide, which is like a canned corn flavor, which if you've ever had Rolling Rock, it's really strong in that beer. But I'm completely unable to pick up that category, even in really high thresholds. So typically when you're coming up with a sensory panel of different people, you try to have a big group of people that have a wide spectrum of what they can pick out on different flavors and stuff. What other kind of aromas are we getting in here? Let's see, where is sulfur under? Because I get just a little bit of sulfur. Solvent? No.
I did add tea, actually.
Okay, under woody? Or
Herbaceous.
herbaceous? Oh, tea.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay,
I do have some flavors of tea.
all right,
Maybe like green tea. I'm not sure.
sure. Man, I'm surprised that I don't find sulfur under here or yeast flavors or aromas.
It's got that kind of that sulfur is, I think, definitely the better way to explain it. But for me, it's like musty plastic almost. Like
Okay.
that's how it
And
bites.
oh wait, Chewy, was yours was in a glass bottle, right?
Correct.
Okay, so that's one thing that I want to get into real quick before we go any farther. So if you can hold that bottle up to the screen.
Sure. Let me get better situated here.
Okay. So
You wanna
okay. So
chat?
Chewy's is in a brown glass bottle. Mine is in a can, and this is going to make a big difference because hops have UV interactions, and when UV strikes hops that are in beer, it actually makes. Let me jump over to here. We go. It makes the same chemical that skunks produce. So when you hear somebody describe a beer as being skunky, if beer is in clear glass like Corona, or if it's in green glass like many imported beers are, then it's light struck. And let me see if I can actually zoom in on this just a little bit farther. There we go. So 3-methyl 2-butyl 1-thiol is the chemical, and it's literally the same chemical composition that skunks produce. So beer is, unless you have a very specially, it's like a downstream product hop called Tetra hops, where they take the hops and they treat them in a certain way so this interaction doesn't happen. So Miller products use the special treated hop. So that's why if you get Miller Lite or Miller High Life in a glass bottle, it will not be skunky because it can't make this chemical reaction happen. But many people associate that skunkiness with like quality beer because for so many years European imported beers were in green glass, and with that whole travel across the ocean and then in stores and everything else, it would make that skunky light struck character. And this can happen in as quick as a couple minutes. So like even if you have a beer and you're sitting out on like a patio and it's sunny, if you're drinking a really highly hopped IPA or something like that, just from being out in the just from being in the sun, this interaction can happen. So if you ever have the opportunity to buy clear glass or green glass versus a can or even dark glass, you should probably go for the category or for the package that doesn't let any light in. So, hey DB, welcome to the stream. So let's go back to the app real quick. Let's skip back or go to aroma. So let's go to tastes. All right. So we've smelled the beer. We've gotten an idea of what we're getting in the aroma. Let's do our first sip. So give your beer a little bit of a swirl. Do another little quick sniff. Take a sip. Ooh, that's good beer. I get a little bit of bitterness, much more bitter than you might expect from a American light lager or some industrial Pilsner kind of beer. There's definitely a pronounced bitterness there.
I was expecting something very airy like Budweiser or something,
So let's see. Sweet, I would say this is on the this is on the low sweetness scale. Salty, I don't get. Sour, I don't get. Bitterness, I would go maybe medium. And it's not that this is super bitter like an IPA, but it's the perceived bitterness that is really important.
Yeah, the bite on the tongue there,
so
the sides of the mouth and everything.
Let's see if we can get that to register. All right, so and then if you click on the show more on the app, there's a really long list of things that you can get in the taste here. So umami is sweet, salty, sour. What am I forgetting for the other senses? Sweet, salty, sour, and help me out here, guys.
Isn't it bitter?
Bitter, yeah. Okay, so sweet, salty, sour, and bitter. That's embarrassing. And then umami is kind of the other sense that many scientists are finally coming around to agreeing exists, and this is a richness, or often described as like portobello mushrooms or Parmigiano Reggiano cheese. It's like a very a rich, savory characteristic, and in a beer like this, I would not expect it to happen. But if you were having a maybe like a barrel-aged stout or some kind of really big beer like that, umami would not be an uncharacteristic character to be in there. For me, I don't necessarily get fatty or metallic. Mineraliness, I don't feel like this is super mineral. A very mineral beer will almost have like almost like a saltiness to it. Bitter lingerness. There's a little bit of a lingering bitterness here. I think I'll put that one on medium for me. So then in terms of, let's go down to mouthfeel. In terms of mouthfeel, we have body, carbonation, alcohol, mouthwatering, astringency, and spicy. So let's see.
Very light body, I'd say.
Yeah, it's crisp. I'd have to say thin, because the next one is medium, and I don't think I'd describe this as a medium-bodied beer. Pretty effervescent, pretty highly carbonated. Alcohol seems pretty low. There's no warming that you get in like the back of your throat or the back of your mouth. Mouth-watering. I don't know. That's I mean, I definitely want to drink another after I have one sip, so I think I'll put that one up on medium for me. Astringency, for me, this is not very astringent. There's not like a
What is that?
I would describe astringent as being like aspirin-y, or if you had hops that were really unpleasant to have in your mouth, like a bitterness that was almost like jarring. Astringent's not something that we often have in food. But if you had something that was really bitter and aggressive, you might describe it as being astringent.
So like the first step towards revulsion?
Maybe, yeah.
If revulsion is the extreme level of that scale? Okay.
And then for me, I would not necessarily describe this beer as being spicy, although the hops that they use in here often are described as being spicy. In this case, spicy is not necessarily going to be like a chili, but it's going to be a different way of describing spice. maybe it could be like a very herbally or herbaceous hop. But for me, this is pretty low on the spicy scale. So if we click over to next, let's see where this takes us to. Come on, Drap Lab. Okay, so we have 3 completed tastings here. So for me, this is what is the coolest thing about the app. So we get an average of what everybody's tasted and smelled in this. So white foam, clear beer, light orange, and because our sample size is pretty small, this information is not going to be super useful, but it's a cool way to look at it. And then we've got a really cool chart here when we go over to aroma. So we get grassy, fruity, herbaceous, medicinal, earthy, sweet, aromatic, and you get the breakdown for all those. And then when we go to tastes, we can visualize bitterness, sweetness, etc., mouthfeel. So if you have a whole bunch of people doing this, and in the beer schools of the future, if we get a bunch of people together, I think this is a really cool thing to visualize what everybody's tasting, and another way to describe what you're picking out of beer. So it's not like when you're going to like a super snooty wine tasting and it's like, ooh, is that passion fruit? It's like, yeah, well, okay, well maybe you can get passion fruit out of it, but this is a little bit this is a little bit less pretentious way of going through our evaluations. So, all right. So Pilsner Urquell, that's the first Pilsner. I think it's still a really cool beer. One other thing I wanted to show you guys was, let's see if we jump over
Who
here.
did you say made the app? It's someone you know?
It's one of the people that helped develop it is one of the lead sensory people at New Belgium, who's a friend of mine. She's a super brilliant woman, and she does a lot of the sensory and evaluation training at New Belgium. And they helped build this app for breweries. And this is the free version. And then there's a professional version that you can use at work, which we actually do use at work. So I wanted to show you this other video clip real quick from the Pilsner Urquell brewery. So once upon a time, they used to ferment all of their beer in these enormous wooden vessels, and you can see Michael walking around the brewery. But they had one of the largest cooperages in the world, and they had these giant wooden vessels, and they would line them with pitch, and they would. Every single time they would basically fire up in the middle of the barrel, burn all of the pitch out, and then re-pitch the barrels, and that would seal the wood. So it's not that it was necessarily getting character from the wood, but they would ferment in these giant wooden vessels. And they had these, I think they probably still do, they have these enormous cellars underneath the brewery that you can see him walking around in right now. And they would fill these breweries, and they actually did at this point in the 80s they had open fermentation, which was really extraordinary. You don't see open fermentation in very many breweries anymore. Normally you see stainless steel vessels, closed fermentation. It can be very dicey to have open top tanks because literally anything floating in can just come in. Thank you for the follow, Birdie. I'm not sure what took you so long. So you have these open top vessels, and this is just really extraordinary. And from a beer geek point of view, I don't know if they still do this at Pilsner Urquell. I would really love to go there someday. But if they still do something like this, it's really, really amazing. So they would ferment in these open top vessels, and they would let that go for a couple weeks. And at this point, Pilsner Urquell was making beers that lagered for 3 months, which is a really long lagering time. It's not uncommon to have a beer that would be made in a lager in the United States. It would be made in about 4 weeks. And that would be an acceptable amount of lagering time. Less than that, and you're really pushing it. Lager yeast takes a long time to develop the flavors and aromas that you want in a beer, and you can't really rush it. But they would do these open top fermentations, and then after like a week or two, they would put them in closed vessels. But they just have this insane giant network of caves and stuff underneath the brewery that have been there for years and years and years. And let me see if we jump through. You can see these guys rolling these giant barrels.
I'm very surprised of all the humidity that's clearly showing in those places.
Yep.
I would think that this environment would be prone to have mushrooms and all sorts of other bacteria that you wouldn't want to have in an open cast
Exactly.
beer that's going to be sitting there for 3 months. I understand that it's cold, but there's still some bacteria that are like going around in the cold. So I'm very, very surprised that they're not getting any other sorts of mess up with that kind of setup.
The way that they described what they're doing here is burning out the pitch of the barrel. But the way they described it as being okay was because the lager or the yeast fermentation, the yeast that they put in there intentionally to ferment the beer, was fermenting so actively that it would bring the pH down, and it's an inhospitable environment for the wild yeast or wild bacteria that might be in there. And then they did close off the beers and move them into closed vessels after the fermentation started to die down. But for that first week or so, they had open top fermentation, which was, like I said, extremely unusual. And really cool to see something like that. And like I said, I don't know if they still do this at the Urquell Brewery, but I would really love to go to Pilsen someday to see this, because just like, this is like, well, actually, this beer series, the Beer Hunter, was one of the main, like, it's just like a super romantic look at beer brewing around the world, and it's definitely one of the reasons why I got into beer in the first place, and why I went into brewing professionally. So
I thought that was a scouting video for PlayerUnknown's Spawn, so I was looking at all the AK locations.
It totally is one of those. And let me see, if you jump around in this other one, there's this other really cool thing. He's at the Budweiser brewery. Let me jump back over to this. So the original Budweiser, which who was able to get Czechvar? Was I the only one that was able to get Czechvar, or Giggle, did you get Czechvar?
I have.
No, I couldn't, but I do have some. I was looking into the ones that are similar, so I do have a similar one, though.
Okay, well, you can go ahead and grab that, and we'll have that all together. Great. So what Michael's describing in this video is that the foam was so substantial that you could put a coin on it and it would float. And this is at the Budweiser, the original Budweiser brewery, Budweiser Budvar. So the might be a little bit confusing that I was asking about Czechvar, but so there was this guy named August Busch who had this beer and thought it was super cool, and he opened a brewery in St. Louis, and you might have heard of it. It was called Budweiser, and so he heard of this other
little brewery,
this other Budweiser brewery, and he decided that he was going to make a beer and call it basically the same thing. And so for years, they Anheuser and Budvar had this legal dispute about who was able to call their beer Budweiser, because for 700 years they've been making this beer at Budweiser, and they weren't able to call their beer Budweiser in the U.S., and it was really, really obnoxious. So what the compromise was that they started to call their beer Czechvar instead of Budweiser. So this is the original Budweiser. You can see it's in a green glass bottle, and if you look at the label on the back, it says, let's see, best before March 30th, 2018. So I would be extremely suspicious. Like, if I went to the store and this was anywhere near March 30th of next year, there's no way I'd be buying this beer, because it's in a green glass bottle. It's probably already going to be skunked to a certain degree.
Oh, man.
But let's see what this looks like.
I'm December of this year, so we might be skunking, boys.
Okay. So you've already got a green glass, so we'll see what happens after this. So pour this out. Oh yeah, and I can smell it from here already. It's quite strong. But if let's go back and see if we can do another rating on here. Let me pull Draft Lab back up for you guys.
That's
All right.
before the 1900s.
So our code for Czechvar is going to be DJ. Yo DJ 8T2. There we go. And before we get into all of the Draft Lab ratings. Let's just go through and evaluate and just give this a quick evaluation, as it were. So, super bright, super pale. Just if you hold the two together, and this is one of the reasons why it's nice to have both beers together. If you hold them together, and if you can get a white background, they're pretty close in color. I would say that the Czechvar is a more of a straw, more of a paler gold color. The Pilsner Urquell is a little bit more orange. They're not dramatically different, but I think there's definitely a difference if you hold them side by side. If we do a little bit of a sniff on here, there's definitely some skunkiness. Like I smelled it right away as soon as I opened it, and as I get my nose in there, it definitely is a lot more.
I do not smell this skunk.
Well, that's good. I mean, it's not something that you're typically looking for when you're trying to enjoy a beer, but I'm definitely getting some skunkiness, especially compared to the beer out of the can. The Pilsner Urquell to me has much more of a malty graininess, a pleasant malt sweetness, and for me, the aroma is a little bit more muted in the Czechvar. It's not coming out quite as strong. Hey, Giggle, which one are you enjoying?
It's a old style Pilsner. It's pretty much the same. It's Molson that makes it here, but it's the same recipe pretty much.
Oh, interesting.
Obviously, it's not going to be exactly the same, but I think from what I read, it's the most similar ones that I could find.
Cool. Bertie was asking, what is the preferred container for purchasing your beer? So anything that keeps light out of your beer is going to be more advantageous. And if you can get brown glass, it's better than clear glass or green glass. And if you can get a can, it's going to be the best because you can't get light into a can. So let's go through and taste this beer real quick. Let's see. That can is hilarious. That looks like, what is that? That's like Super Irie Pilsner glass or Pilsner can.
Yep. It says old style Pilsner. That's it.
Like, not old style like Heilmann's old style from Chicago, like old style, old country kind of. That's funny. Okay. I don't think I've ever seen that before. All right.
Yeah.
Let's go through and do some app stuff real quick. So, color, for me, this is light straw. No haze.
Must be my glass. I'm still sitting on that dark yellow.
And you guys can go through on this. We'll follow along on mine. Lacing. Okay, so we talked about lacing. Let me bring this back real quick. As I said, having a clear glass is going to make a difference, or having a very clean glass. And you can see how the foam is kind of gently sticking to the side. It can mean that you have a very fine foam quality, but it's not really indicative of anything beyond the fact that you're drinking out of a clean glass. Like if you have beer that doesn't lace, it doesn't mean that it's a bad beer. It just means that it's not lacing. It's one of those kind of like old-fashioned ways of thinking about beers, but it honestly doesn't have a ton of bearing on whether or not it's a quality beer. So lacing, I got some, I'll call that moderate lacing. It's still sitting there. And the foam quality it's keeping a head on there. It's pretty nice. But again, foam is almost entirely dependent on whether or not you have a clean glass. So when's Jaeger School? You can do Jaeger School as after hours extracurricular. I don't think we're going to do Jaeger School. So. Let's see. Bertie asks, I don't drink beer too often. I like my liquors also. Is that something we could get into anyways? Different whiskeys, bourbons, and such. I'm totally into doing bourbons or whiskeys. I think the threshold is going to be a little bit more difficult to get a whole bunch of people involved, especially in terms of like, hey, we're going to taste a whole bunch of different whiskeys, but maybe we could do like one or two and try to pick it apart. I'm not as experienced in evaluating whiskeys professionally. I mean, I've certainly drank a lot of them, but beer is obviously my wheelhouse.
That makes you a
So,
pro. What are you
yeah,
talking
exactly. So I don't know, whiskeys, maybe something we can put in the suggestion box. Foam dispersion.
If drinking a lot makes you a pro, I mean,
Yeah, exactly, right?
I'm on top of it right there.
about? You should ace this class, Giggle.
Oh,
I don't think I can finish the class if I start one. That's the problem.
and so Kev brings up another interesting point. He was kind of joking about sip and spit, but when we evaluate beers, it's very important to swallow your sample because one, you have bittering receptors in your mouth and in the back of your throat, the back of your mouth and in your throat. Whereas wine, there's not a bittering component in wine. So if you don't swallow wine, you can still evaluate it entirely and still spit it out. But with beer, if you want to get the full bittering experience, you have to swallow it.
Yeah.
Additionally, if you take a sample of beer and you swallow it and you hold your breath, but you don't breathe back out through your mouth, you breathe out through your nose, you can retronasally evaluate beers. And sometimes that characteristic can be different from the way that you smell it in the first time. So it's actually important to, if you're really getting technical about it, you definitely A, need to swallow the beers, and B, there are different ways that you can evaluate it by pushing air through your sinuses in different ways, which is definitely some inside baseball beer tasting stuff, but it's super valid.
When
Yeah.
I went to visit the NSC Fabric in Cognac a couple of years ago, they were explaining how and who actually evaluates the different cognac that's being produced, and how they're going to be, with somewhat of a app like that, we'll be using the different taste that's going to be gathered to be building the upcoming cognac that's going to be sold. And so they have some sorts of references from every year, how sweet it is, or acid it is, and all sorts of other things. And I was I wasn't surprised, but I was still surprised to learn that they're spitting out every time they're tasting. But for me, when I'm tasting some cognac or some hard liquor, I actually want to have it down my throat because there's some feels to it and how it's going to come back up into your nose as a perfume. And so I was very surprised to understand that they actually cannot drink. They would have severe issues if they would, but
Yeah,
again,
if you're
there's some
evaluating.
ways to be tasting some alcohol. It really, really relates to how you perceive, well, in within your nose, but everything inside your mouth, and more than the actual taste. Sometimes it's going to be like how thick it is on your tongue, and it's just you have to get in there and then wait for the back taste to come back. I mean, I don't know. It's just how it's done. It's just I'm very surprised at how it was explained and how they're not going through with swallowing.
I think if you're going to be evaluating 30 or 40 cognac samples in a day, you're probably going to be hard pressed to swallow all of those samples. But yeah, no, I totally get what you're saying.
Absolutely.
I've judged a number of times at the Great American Beer Festival, which is one of the big beer festivals that the Brewers Association puts on, and that's 3 days of judging, and you can evaluate upwards of 200 or more samples in those couple days. So even though you're getting poured like a 3-ounce sample of beer to evaluate, after the end of the week, it's like, give me the margarita, give me the gin tonic, because it's just so much beer for that amount of time. But and that's in tiny little samples. So yeah, it can be quite a chore. Which I know everybody's like, boo-hoo, you get to drink beer all day long. But when you're trying to do this professionally in large quantities, it can be overwhelming. So.
Did you get something to change your taste in between everything you tasted, like a coffee, or, I mean, obviously you want to reset your taste, right?
Typically, if you're judging at a festival like that, you're doing one category and you're judging to style guidelines. So actually, I have the style guidelines in front of me for Pilsners. So let me read those to you real quick. Let's see. This is a description of a Czech Pilsner. It's not the Great American Beer Festival style guidelines, but let's see. Sometimes known as Bohemian Pilsner, light straw to golden color, crystal clear. Hops are very prevalent, usually with a spicy bitterness and or a spicy floral flavor and aroma. Notably, one of the defining characteristics of the Zod's hop. Smooth and crisp with a clean malty palate, many are grassy. Some of the originals will show some archaic yeast characteristics similar to very mild buttery or fusel parentheses rose-like alcohol flavors and aromas, which what that's really referring to is some of the Czech lager yeasts will produce a little bit of diacetyl during fermentation, which is that mild butter character which they're talking about. I haven't tasted it in any of these two so far, but it's not uncommon in the Czech lagers. In most American beers and in German lagers, you would not find that, and it would be considered an off flavor. But so far, I haven't picked those up yet. But yeah, when you're judging at GABF or a similar festival like that, you're judging to a category. So like if we were doing Pilsners, we would have the style guidelines, and you would have probably, if it was an early round, you would have 10 beer samples in front of you, and you'd have about an hour to go through and taste all the samples and see how they match to those guidelines. And then if you need a palate cleanser, typically they have something at the table like bread or matzah or something that's very mildly flavored so that you can use it as a kind of a palate cleanser. I don't typically see people have something that's wildly different like coffee. But it's a personal thing. Just depends on how you judge and evaluate. So.
And I actually have another question in regards to how taste is perceived.
Mm-hmm.
I noticed on the app, and then we haven't really talked about how chilled it is.
Yeah.
So obviously, beer is going to taste different if it's chilled or not,
It
or
definitely
how
is.
chilled it is. And some beers are supposed to be drank warmer, and some other are supposed to be drank cooler. But then again, like we haven't talked about this, and I was wondering, for the Pilsner, is it known to be something that you drink very chill, or somewhat warm?
I think pretty much in very general terms, almost any lager that you have is going to be served pretty cold. Not so cold that it's like freezing your tongue and your taste buds, but it's definitely a cold style of beer to drink. And the Pilsners, I think that anytime that you're having a beer, as it warms, you're going to get more characteristics out of it because the flavors are just the flavors and aromas are going to kind of bloom out of there. And when it's cold, your senses are a little bit muted. But this is a beer that I think it's a thirst quenching, beer to drink during warm weather. And it's a beer that you would expect to be served cold. Now, if you're trying to evaluate a beer, if you have a small sample like this and you're holding it in your hands and you're using the warmth of your hands to warm it up, that's totally, if you're trying to pick out every little piece of it, then yeah, that you can definitely use that, and that's a super valid method for trying to warm your beer up and try to see what maybe little nuances you're missing. But in general, I would describe Pilsners as, a beer that you would be drinking pretty cold.
And last but not least, what about the glass you're using?
Shape is definitely going to affect the way that you perceive the beer. All of the glasses that I have in front of me today are kind of a tulip-shaped glass, and that's really to kind of focus the aroma into into your nose, so that as you're swirling something that kind of looks like this, it's bringing the aromas up to a center part like that, so it's easier for you to get what's in there. But a traditional Pilsner style glass, I think you have one in front of you, but let me pull the picture up. Yeah, that fluted style is let me see here. So this is a super typical shape for Pilsner, and the reason that it's in that shape is because, like I said, this is a style of this is a glass that was invented when clear glass was made commercially available to people. Like this is the way that you were showing off your brand new crystal clear golden colored beer that didn't exist before that. So Pilsners, it's not like a Belgian style beer where there's tons of different little bits of aroma that you're trying to pick out of there. It's really, the glass was designed to show off the bright golden color. So because it's fluted and out like that, it's not going to concentrate the aromas into the center. But, the glass is made for just enjoying. It's not really made for like see how amazing these hops smell so much. Um, but when I'm drinking beer at home, I'm typically going to be drinking beer out of usually a shape like this, unless I have just a big like English style pint glass, and I'm just trying to. I don't necessarily need to be challenged with every beer that I have. I'm perfectly happy just to have an easy drinking beer that it's not gonna like change my world with every sip. So,
And then to add to what you're saying, I don't know if you guys are seeing how clear it is. Like you can actually see through with this style of glass, and that's the whole purpose it's we're mentioning, right?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, super bright, super clear, and golden, which up until that point just did not exist. Which is it's such a especially for a brewer, it's such an unusual thing to consider because like if you ask somebody to draw a picture of a glass of beer, they're probably going to draw something that's fizzy, yellow, and golden like that. And up into the mid 1800s, that didn't even exist. Beer was cloudy. It was dark colored, and it usually had some kind of smoke character to it. And because they really didn't even know what yeast and bacteria were, it often had some type of souring in it too. So there's a lot of beer not terribly long ago was radically different from the beer that we know now. And then Kev asks in chat too, what about those glasses with the laser etchings on the bottom? Is it a gimmick for gimmick's sake, or does it have a tangible effect on the beer? I think what you're referring to is, sometimes they'll have a glass and they will take a laser and they'll etch basically a nucleation point in the bottom of the glass. And it's a little spot for the CO2 to bubble off. And it's, in my opinion, it's just for show. It's if you have a big glass of beer and you see these tiny little bubbles flowing up the entire time, it's just kind of a cool thing to look at because if you really, it's not really pushing the aroma out into the headspace of the glass, because if you want that, you just look, okay, I'm shaking my glass, see all the bubbles, cool. It doesn't have anything to do with a laser etching in the bottom. A lot of glassware and a lot of very special shapes of glassware are kind of just for gimmicks. I mean, you can only have glass in so many different shapes, and honestly, unless it's concentrated at the top or it's splayed out at the top, it's not going to make a huge difference about what shape your glass is. Now, where you're holding your glass, if you have a pint glass and you have your big fat hands around it the entire time, then that's going to, warm your glass up, and that's going to have an effect. If you have a stemmed glass like this, then you can hold it down here and the heat from your hand is not transferring into the glass. So that part of it could make a difference, but
somewhat similar to when tasting wine, I guess.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, if you're trying to heat your wine sample up, or if you're trying to keep it at room temperature, if you're drinking a red wine, if you're drinking a white wine, those components definitely have important characteristics on how you perceive the beer. But in general terms, things like laser etchings on the bottom of a glass, it's just to look cool. It doesn't really have an effect on things. And then Birdie also asks, for tasting purposes, is it better to pour into a glass rather than drink beer out of a bottle or a can? What are the downfalls to just tasting straight out of the bottle or the original container? Well, for purposes like this, you can imagine if you're drinking beer out of a can and you're trying to get the aroma out of that tiny little hole, you're not going to get the same experience as you would if you were pouring it into a glass, letting that CO2 bubble out and getting the aromas to come into that headspace. There's nothing wrong with drinking beer out of a can. You're just going to have a different experience than you would pouring it into a glass. So it's not that one is better or worse. It's just that they're going to be different. Once upon a time, when cans were made differently, now cans almost all have a very thin protective liner on the inside of them. Cans used to be just basically tin or unprotected aluminum, and you did get a metallic characteristic from either drinking straight out of the can, or even if you had beer in a can and you poured it into a glass, it had interacted with that metal and it gave you some kind of gross metallic character. Now that's not the case, and modern cans should not be imparting any kind of can character into the beer, metallic or otherwise. But in terms of, like I said before, light cans are going to be the best. Cans or draft beer are going to be the best way because there's no light getting in there. Draft beer, beers in stainless steel keg. There's no light getting in there. And then in terms of shipping, cans weigh less than glass. So many breweries are going to cans because they're easier they're lighter to ship, which makes a big difference when you start talking about volumes. Excuse me. Okay, so let's get back to this Czechvar real quick. We haven't really talked too much about it. So, Chewy, what do you? Let's get back into this. How is this? What are you smelling and tasting, and how is this different from the first beer that we did, the Pilsner Urquell?
I'd have to refresh myself on this one since it's been a minute.
Okay.
That was good Q&A session.
I'll give you a chance.
Yeah, definitely that very light sweetness.
Mm-hmm.
Not overtly sweet, but that light, grainy sweetness. I want to say a little bit floral, but I don't know if that's just the grainy notes more
Okay.
so than anything else. That's really all I'm taking away from it, though.
For me, when I go back, the Czechvar versus the Pilsner Urquell, when I go back to the Pilsner Urquell, I get much more of a malty aroma and a little bit of a graininess. The Czechvar, to me, is a little bit cleaner, a little bit crisper, and a little bit more of a hop aroma.
Okay.
I actually am getting myself a bit more of a taste of the grains, actually, than
Okay.
I was to the previous beer. I don't know if that coincides with what you guys are, because it's a different one that I have. So I want to.
Would you describe it more as a graininess, like an unpleasant graininess, or just a malt character? Because sometimes grainy is a negative descriptor for a beer. And
No, it's not negative. I'd say it's more of a bread thing.
Okay.
Yeah, it's like
Almost like bread.
yeah, it's like that wheat, that very weedy, dough kind of. I can definitely smell that crispness, though. I can get it in my sinuses, and both when I smell it and taste it.
Let's go through a couple of these descriptors in the app and see what we might be picking out, especially versus the Pilsner Urquell. So for me, I don't necessarily get a fruitiness. I think there's a little bit of a floral character in here. For me, it's I would describe it as a hoppy floralness, though not so much as like a flower, but
Somewhat of a butter taste.
a little. Are you getting the butter from the yeast?
Yeah. Yeah.
Let's see. A little bit grassy,
I-
maybe. Let me see. Is it grassy? I get maybe just a little bit of grassiness. I also, despite the fact that this beer is a low alcohol beer, most of these beers average in alcohol by volume in about 4% to 5.5%. So that's a pretty light ABV beer. I get a little bit of a alcohol characteristic in the nose.
Yeah, that might be that kind of crispness I think I'm experiencing.
It's not super boozy, and it can't be for that low of an alcohol. But it's I get a little bit of it. Let's see. What
Kind of
else?
like an ethanol bite.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's exactly what I mean. But I don't get that in. Oh, here, alcoholic. We can get maybe. Oh, this is one other thing about the app that I forgot. If you don't want to pick a subcategory, you can just click the plus sign on the mother category, and it will give you. It'll just choose that as one of the descriptors. So you don't necessarily, if you're getting medicinal, you don't have to say, oh, it's definitely burnt rubber. You can just click medicinal, and that'll give you a check mark for that side of it. So for me, I get a little bit of sweet aromatic, not a ton. I get a little bit of floral from what I think is the hops. Maybe just a little, maybe we'll call that maybe a little bit herbaceous. Maybe a little bit grassy. And then I think I'm going to click alcoholic too. So, and then let's see. Taste sweet. To me, this one tastes much less sweet than the Pilsner Kel.
Absolutely, I do agree with that one.
Let's see. Low on the sweetness. I don't get salty. Bitterness. There's definitely a little bit of bitterness there. I wonder how. For me, I think the bitterness is actually lower than the Pilsner Kel. I think it's cleaner
Yeah.
and crisper, and it's not as bitter, which is
Hmm.
a little bit unusual going back to it because I'm getting more malt character out of the Pilsner Kel, but I'm getting also higher bitterness.
Do we know what kind of hops are used to create that bitterness in the Pilsner?
I don't know specifically. Traditionally, you would use Zaz almost exclusively, but modern breweries are going to use just basically any bittering hop for bitterness. In many cases, they're just going to use a hop extract, a bittering extract, and then they'll use the Zaz for flavor and aroma. Or they might use another German noble hop, like Tettnang or Hallertau or one of the other Styrian Goldings, Spalt or Perla, Herzbrucker, Hallertau Mittelfrüh. The hop varieties that are the kind of the traditional ones that you would use in Germany are often also used in Pilsners, mostly for flavor and aroma. For bitterness, I am of the opinion that it really doesn't matter what hop you use for bitterness because you're only getting the bitterness out of that hop. So it really doesn't really matter what hop you're using specifically. It's just the amount of bitterness that you're trying to get into the hop. Let's go through this real quick. So body, I think it's very thin. Carbonation is effervescent. Alcohol tastes low. To me, this is more thirst quenching than mouth watering. It doesn't make me. Mouth-watering is kind of an odd descriptor for me. It's not a way that I typically think of a beer description, but I'm gonna put low, and then I don't feel like this is astringent. I'm gonna put low on that, and then spiciness low as well.
I mean, carbonization is interesting, but it's not champagne interesting. It's
Yeah, it's not
it's
like.
much lighter, delicate.
Mm-hmm. These are typically going to be higher carbonated, pretty highly carbonated beers. Not like a bottle conditioned Belgian style beer, but it should be pretty high. If you're talking about volumes of CO2, I would expect it to be about 2.8 to 3 volumes if you ever are measuring CO2 in that way. Let's go to our visualization here for our cool little pie chart. So we've got grassy, cereal, alcoholic, herbaceous, sweet, aromatic, floral. I think those are reasonable descriptors for these beers.
Come on, man! I thought you said no wrong answers.
No, they're not wrong answers. But if somebody said like, I get marshmallows and campfire or something like that, I would say, well, that's very interesting.
Ripe sewage.
It's really interesting that you're getting that out of this beer, but I would say that is a couple standard deviations away from what everybody else is experiencing. So let's see what else we got. I know Giggle, you were able to get Hollandia and
Yep.
and Labatt Blue, right?
Yep.
And then Chewy, did you just grab those two?
I'm out.
Okay. Well, you're.
Yeah, I didn't know what else to grab.
No,
so.
it's totally fine. We had quite the beer snafu. So should we go Labatt or should we go Hollandia next? Should we save Canada for last?
Yeah, especially. Anyways, we'll talk about this later. But Labatt, I have my own
Strong
dislikes.
negative feelings towards. Yeah. So okay.
Yeah.
All right. So let's check out Hollandia.
All right, be right back.
So this is a beer that I have not ever actually bought before, but when Giggle went to the store, he picked up a whole bunch of different beers, and then since we had this kind of beer snafu, I went and had to my corner store, and it just happened to be there. It is a Dutch Pilsner, and then actually on the ingredients, they list, where'd it go? I saw this. So they have water, malted barley, maltose and hop extract listed. So what that means to me is that they're probably brewing this as a high gravity beer. And then I can try to show this, but it's mostly a green can, so we'll see how much of that actually shows up. So, and the cans actually look a little bit different. Oh, you got the special Canadian edition, I guess. So because they specifically say that they're adding maltose and hop extract to this, my guess is that they're doing high gravity brewing, which is a kind of an industrial lager way of making beers where you make your beer, but you make it to a higher concentration than you would normally, and then you water it back down to get to the specs that you're trying to get to. So this beer is a Dutch version of a Pilsner. Super brilliant and bright and yellow, just like the other ones. We're getting, I don't know if you can even see it, but the bottom of this glass has some of those nucleation points, like Kev was talking about, and I don't know if you can really see. My green screen's not really into the. You can kind of see them just a little bit, yeah.
I see it's very different from mine, actually.
The colors are different.
The carbonization process.
Carbonization. Okay. Yeah, mine was in a can too, so they should be pretty similar. But it does say that it was made in Holland, so it's not being. Mine at least was not being contract brewed somewhere else. This says.
No, it says brewed in Holland too.
Yeah, Meersen, Holland, or Marsen. Yep. Some Hollander can correct me on the pronunciation.
But it might just be the glass actually that shows different.
It could be, yeah, and it could be our cameras, and there's a lot of different different ways on here. So let's dive into this one real quick. So, oh, that's unusual. I'm getting a very different aroma on that beer than the other two.
Yep.
Kind of an unpleasant
apple-like.
Yeah, a green apple, kind of a. We would describe that as acetaldehyde, which is a chemical that can be produced during fermentation when yeast is stressed out a little bit, and it definitely is like a green apple character that gets added. And
will we be creating a code for this one?
You know what? Since it's just the two of us, and I don't think anybody else has it at home, we can go ahead and skip it for these, and then maybe if somebody in chat says they have Labatt, we can do it too. But we'll cruise through these real quick. So yeah, I definitely get that little bit of green apple. Kind of, it's not that it's unpleasant, but it's very out of place, especially on the first two beers that we've had. For me, that's extremely light. There's not a ton of flavor there. It's a really light, pretty crisp.
Yeah.
Very, very low.
Maybe more
bitterness.
Metallic, this one.
Do you get some metallic?
Yeah.
Yeah. Once you.
More than the first ones, anyways.
Yeah, Bertie, I don't really have a schedule yet. Sundays so far have been the way that we've been doing beer school. This is obviously only the second one. Weekends for sure are really the only reasonable way that I can swing these. But we don't have a schedule, mostly because it's just hard to wrangle my schedule with two kids and everything else, and then getting other super pro MLG streamers to join in too can be a bit of a challenge. A lot of wrangling, and then once we get past all of my start stream technical problems, it's just a miracle that we can get anything done at all. So I'll just keep doing them randomly as we can kind of fit them in. And I would really like to convince some of my beer industry friends to join me, but then finding people that have a camera and a microphone is a little bit of a challenge. Maybe they can get in with some like laptop, some stuff, but it's the marriage of video game community and beer community is so far a little rocky in terms of like I want to get my buddies to join in, but not really everybody has a stream set up. So yeah, what are you going?
Yep. I can agree with that. I have actually been brewing multiple times, and I did stream it. I had very good feedback and everything, but it's a pain to like manage everything at the same time if you're doing it all by yourself. And I mean, it's great to be showing, But then again, like to move all of my computers around and bring them to my kitchen, and the lightings, and the environment is so rude with like all of the warmth and the humidity, and I mean everything. It's not good. It's really hard to do. Like,
Yeah.
so if you think of it this way, if you want to bring some friends over that are into brewing and that are professional into it, yeah, it's going to be difficult sometimes, but I'm sure it's going to be interesting. Whatever you bring up so far, it's been great. So
I mean, even if they just have a laptop with a camera and some earbuds or something like that, we could make it work. But yeah, it can be a bit of a challenge. But we'll see how it goes. I would really like to get some other people involved and see how it goes, because I think it's fun. So we'll see if we can wrangle some other people in. So let's go back to this Hollandia real quick. For me, once you said green apple, I really can't get past that. It's kind of it's almost like a green grape or a green apple.
I wanted to go pear, but
Pear?
it's more of an apple.
Yeah, I think there definitely is some acetaldehyde in there, which could just be the flavor profile of that beer, or it could be that they had
Yeah.
some kind of yeast issue. It's really difficult to say, but pretty light. There's not a lot of
Because
bitterness.
this is, I mean, some people might not know, and this is where it's interesting. Some of the flavors that we're going to be looking into might actually be good things that they were maybe looking to do with the yeast or any other ingredients that they're adding, but it might actually be a side effect from the yeast and those ingredients that might have some issues when they were into the fermentation process, or they were not into the right temperature, or they were mixed with the hops for too long before going into the secondary brew fermentation part. And I know that green apple might be one, banana taste might be one, and there's so many other ones too. Maybe you can share some more on what we're tasting and what it actually could represent in this case.
Yeah, I think in this case, it's definitely a yeast byproduct, or it's a fermentation byproduct from the yeast. That green apple character. The most common ones that you will find in beers are diacetyl, like we mentioned before, which is that movie butter or butter character, which actually is what they add to buttered popcorn for microwave popcorn. They produce diacetyl, I don't know, through industrial fermentation or something, and they add that to the popcorn to give you that movie butter character. That can either be from a yeast byproduct, and yeast will eat the diacetyl back up during fermentation. But if you aren't handling your yeast the right way, it'll stay in the beer. Or it can be a infection from a wild yeast or bacteria that will produce diacetyl during a beer's fermentation. So diacetyl is a major off flavor, especially ones that American brewers are typically trained to not enjoy. In English beers and in some Czech Pilsners, a very tiny amount of diacetyl in a beer can be enjoyable, or even appropriate for the style. Sometimes you can get a isovaleric acid, which is like circus peanuts. Like if you get those orange circus peanuts at the store and you get that kind of artificial banana character or whatever the hell they describe circus peanuts as tasting like, you can get that in beer, and that's another fermentation byproduct. The green apple.
So as a kind of a side real quick then, banana is considered a core flavor though of a traditional Hefeweizen, right?
Absolutely, yeah. So Hefeweizen yeast has two main, or Hefeweizen as a style has two main flavor or aroma components that you would expect to find: clove and that banana character. And the clove is actually activated during a very specific temperature rest in the mash process. That later gets turned into clove character during fermentation, and then the banana character comes from is a byproduct of the yeast, but it's an intentional flavor. It doesn't come from the wheat, even though Hefeweizens typically have 50% or more wheat as part of the malt bill. But in that style of beer, it's a flavor positive characteristic. If you were to have banana character, those esters in a Pilsner beer like this, you would consider it completely inappropriate, or it'd be an off flavor.
Gotcha.
Um,
Gotcha.
So yeah, it's all of those yeast is such an incredible organism because it's a single-celled organism, but as its byproduct of doing that work, you get this enormous variety of flavors and aromas that you can get from its doing its work. Some of those for some beers are positive, some of those are negative, but there's hundreds and hundreds of different flavors and aromas that you can get as a fermentation byproduct. So yeah, trying to get those into your beer is really about putting your yeast in the right conditions to get that out. How do you, Giggle? How do you feel like this beer compares to the first two that we tried?
Well, visually, they're very, very similar. I was looking at the bubbles, and it's pretty much the same. This one is maybe a bit more thicker when it comes to the color. But other than that, carbonization, color-wise, clearliness, we're at the same place.
Mm-hmm.
It really is very, very, very similar. Some of them have a bit more of a buttery apple taste, like we just talked about, but yeah, Pilsner being Pilsner, it's I feel it's very delicate, and yeah, like you mentioned before, it's one of those beer when it's very warm and then you get a very chilled one, it's just gonna, it's gonna be very appreciated during summertime. Yeah, very simple.
So now that we've had this Pilsner Urquell out and poured for a little bit, should we go back to the Pilsner Urquell and give it a little bit of a swirl and a sniff? And I think you can pick out that butter character from it, because I definitely just went back and stuck my nose in there, and I'm getting that little bit of buttery movie butterscotch character to it. And it definitely, I did not pick it out at first, but especially now that it's warmed up and then comparing it to these other two, I can definitely pick it out.
Yep.
It's not that it's unpleasant. It's pretty subtle, but it's for me it's definitely there.
It's real subtle, yeah. That's real subtle, yeah. Huh.
So then, how about we do Canada's finest?
Oh, yeah, okay.
All right, so this is
And you know what? I'll tell you why right now. Why I'm not a fan of this beer specifically. The thing is, with this beer, from what I understand, it's made of rice, fermented rice.
yeah,
and it's not mentioned in the beer.
yeah, they don't have ingredients on the label, but for sure.
And I do have like somewhat of a bad reaction when I drink them.
Oh, okay.
Although I can eat rice, it's a non-issue. For some reason, whenever I have this beer specifically that it's made of rice, my belly just goes very, very awkwardly wrong. So that's just me, but that's the reason why. It's not even a taste issue. Not that it's the taste that I'm looking for when I'm drinking beer usually, but I do have a strong reaction when it comes to how my body reacts to this fermented rice.
So
let me just get my
Labatt is a super old Canadian brewery, and the label says the brewery was established in 1847. So if we go back and think about that history of Pilsner originally brewed in 1842. It does not take very long for this style of beer to just rocket around the entire world. Super popular. This is going to be an example of what we would call like an industrial Pilsner, an industrial beer. So like Giggle was saying, I'm almost 100% certain that this is an adjunct Pilsner. So they make the beer with barley and hops and yeast and water, just like normal. But instead of it being and he's even got the blue. Look at that. It's the Quebecois Labatt. Mine is BLUE, and he has the bleu. Do they say Labatt bleu? Or is that too too obnoxious?
They do Labatt bleu.
So in order to make this style of beer extremely light in body and light in flavor and thirst quenching and et cetera, they will add some type of adjunct. In the United States, it's typically corn or rice. Those are the two big extra cereal grains that they'll use to lighten up the flavor. And because those make simpler sugars, it's very easy for the yeast to break those sugars down, and they don't stay behind in the body. So you get alcohol from it, but you don't get a lot of flavor. They're not flavorful grains. They're just made to basically lighten everything up. So this is extremely pale in color. It's extremely effervescent. There is a ton of suds there, and more so even than
this is more champagne-like.
Mm-hmm.
The bubbles are everywhere. It's not as clear as the three first ones actually.
When we do our first smells on here, what do we get? I think I get maybe just a tiny little bit of green apple, not very much. I would not describe it as having a hoppy aroma at all.
To your question, Kev, no, I don't have this reaction with sake. It really is just with Labatt Blue.
It's specific to Labatt. Yeah, they really don't have anything on here other than product of Canada, imported through Buffalo, TM Labatt Brewing Company. That's about it. But yeah, I'm pretty sure that it is an adjunct beer. But super light in flavor. What do you get out of
It's tasteless.
Yeah, it's pretty light. I mean, there's just not much there at all. And this is why I think for many beer drinkers or people that want to be more serious about beer, these kinds of beers have a bad name for a reason. It's not that they're brewed poorly. This is actually extremely difficult to make a beer that has so little flavor and aroma in it and not have off flavors. Like if this were full of diacetyl or full of that green apple or full of some other off flavor, it would be expected. But it's actually extremely difficult to mass produce a very light, very delicate beer like this that there's nothing to hide behind. If you're making a big imperial stout or if you're making an IPA that has tons of hops in it, if you have some flaws, it can be very easy to hide those flaws in the just like the overwhelming flavor and aroma of the other ingredients that you're using. But there's almost nothing in here. I mean, this is super light, super crisp, and it's not that it's super flavorful, but there's nothing there, and having almost nothing there is kind of an accomplishment in itself.
That's exactly what I was explaining when I first started brewing, actually. So we didn't know what to brew or what kind of beer to brew. Like we had expectations that it was just, I don't know, like we were just gonna get the ingredients and follow the recipe, right? And then we just asked the guy at the store, and he was like, you guys are looking to do very like savory, like hard beers, like very very like mouthful and everything, but at the end of the day, the hardest thing to do is those kind of beers, for the sake that it's tasteless, very clear, and it's always the same on an industrial like proportion. It's very hard to do exactly what you're mentioning, and I would be very. It would be very hard for me to go and say, you know what, I'm gonna do this, and it's gonna be easy doing it at home. It's not. Obviously, been brewing for years, and I wouldn't know where to start and what I'm doing wrong. There's a lot of things in action here that I don't understand, and you maybe can explain more than I do from there.
Like I said, the industrial lagers often get a bad rap, but even though I don't care for Budweiser, the fact that they have 12 breweries across the U.S. and they're making basically the exact same beers from different water sources and a little bit different brewing equipment and a little bit of different ingredients because they can't all pull from exactly the same place. It's actually quite extraordinary that they can make beer that tastes the same that they make in LA, that they make in New York, that they make in St. Louis and Florida, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not, I don't really care for those beers, but in terms of technical quality, they're flawless, and it's quite an accomplishment.
Yep. Although, if I do compare the one that we just drank, the Hollandia, next to the Blue, they're visually very different. I feel the Blue is more different than any other one that we had before.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how the bubbles are on your side, but it's so different and it's not as clear as I would expect it to be. As the All India, and every one that we had before was very, very clear.
I don't have any clarity issues on my end, but in terms of aroma, especially when you go back to the other ones, this one's it's just like you made a Pilsner, but it's like you turn the volume down across the board on on everything. You turn the aroma down, you turn the flavor down. It's clean and crisp, but it's just so like middle of the road. There's nothing pushing it in any direction. It's just like it's like you
somehow it seems like
default on all the
sorry.
No, I mean I'm trying to
somehow like the skunk is more of a taste than a smell.
Yeah, sometimes you get those characters that are like you can vice versa. Like sometimes you smell it and it doesn't come through in the flavor, or you do taste it but you don't smell it. But it's pretty.
So brewer, for
innocuous.
sitting shotgun on this one with no taste, how would you rate this in comparison to like a Bud Light or a Coors Light or something that's
they're all
also
in the
flavorless water?
They're all pretty much in the same boat. If you have a whole bunch of those beers side by side, you definitely can pick out some differences. And actually, if you you know what, I might be able to even pull it up while I'm chatting here. But if you the Chicago Tribune, the beer writer for the Trib, pulled one of the brewers from Revolution, one of the brewers from Half Acre, and one of the brewers from Pollyanna, which are three breweries that are here in the Chicagoland area. And he had them do a blind taste test with like 20 beers that were like that. Let me see if I can pull it up. Yeah, here we go. What's the best macro beer in America? 3 craft brewers, taste test 16. And I'll post this in chat so that you guys can check it out. But he had them go through 16, basically these beers. Labatt was not on the list, to my knowledge. But they went through completely blind and tasted. Here, let me just go through them real quick. Hamm's, Miller Lite, Pabst, Keystone Light, Old Style, Coors Banquet, Coors Light, Busch Light, Michelob Ultra, Miller High Life, Budweiser, Busch, Bud Light, Natty Ice, Schlitz, and Ice House. And he had them blind taste
and
all
that's
these
some
beers.
Quality.
And to me, it was
quality brands right there.
It was really, really interesting to see their compliments and to see what they were picking out, similarly to the way that we're doing this. But we know what beers we had in front of us. They only had they were completely blind. And what, long story short, what they ended up picking, they rated Hamm's number 1, Miller Lite number 2, and Pabst number 3 of those 16 that they tasted. And when you had them all side by side, they said that Hamm's was actually quite full flavored, especially compared to the other ones, and that it was the most enjoyable out of all of them. And the ones that were way down on the bottom of the list were Bud Light, Natural Ice, Busch, Ice House, some what they would describe as like sub-premium brands, basically. But Hamm's, Miller Lite, and Pabst were the top 3 when they put all those side by side. So if you ever want the the brewer's taste test in the back of your mind, if you're at a party or something, you're trying to picking one of those out, something to consider.
Yeah. And if you look at who won by order, the 7 first ones are either Miller Scores or Pabst Brewing, and then comes the other one. And it really shows like the quality and the
Miller actually makes Pabst beers because Pabst doesn't have its own brewery. They're all contracted through Miller. So it might be, a little bit of bias against Anheuser, subconscious bias, because Chicago is very much a Miller town. Most of the Miller beers, because Chicago is so close to Milwaukee, and because the Great Chicago Fire happened and it essentially wiped out any Chicago breweries that existed at the time, Miller became the big Midwestern brewing hub aside from St. Louis, and Chicago is very much a Miller town when it comes to big beers like this.
And for the history part, like Molson has been on in Canada at least to be one of the oldest and most major brewers located in Montreal. They're actually moving next week, and they've been there for like 400 years
Wow, that's
in
really
the same
incredible.
location. And they actually are now associated with Coors. They actually bought Coors to give you an
Oh, wow. Okay.
how big it is. Like, so they're now located all across United States as well through different branding names, obviously. But like this one, actually, the Pilsner, the imitation, is something that is made by Molson,
Cool.
and they own Montreal Canadian, and they own so much. They've been there and they've been around the city for a very long time.
Yeah, I think you stepped away when I checked, but Labatt has established 1847 on it, which I mean, the if the first Pilsner was brewed in 1842, it didn't take very long for that to spread all around the rest of the world. So
Yep.
pretty cool. Well, what do we think, guys? Do we have any other questions that were anything else from chat, or anything that we're missing, or what do we? I mean, it might actually be good since we have all these poured in front of us. Real quick, if we go back, does your Pilsner Raquel look now? Does it look significantly darker than the other ones? Does it have like a much more orange hue or a much more golden hue instead of a straw or yellow color? Because for me,
I
it's
can't comment. It's
Oh.
gone.
Yep, it's gone.
Sorry. That was a while ago. It was getting warm, man.
Oh well. Yeah, and that, you know what? When I go back and check the check far, I get that skunkiness. It's still coming through. Anyway, I really enjoy doing stuff like this. I really like doing the side by sides, and I think in terms of from a brewing perspective, if you ever really want to know what a style of beer is all about, you put all that stuff side by side, and you really get a chance to see how things compare to each other, and you can really compare apples to oranges, or apples to apples instead of apples to oranges.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. Well,
So what? I mean, Pilsner being one of the oldest beer that's being brewed. What and when did it come to change this style that was very prominent and still, as of today, one of the most sold beer in the world, and to different forms? And most of the countries have their own version. Like we talked a bit earlier off stream, but like the one that I have from Italia, and then I know when I went to Costa Rica, they have their own too. That's very popular there too, and it's what makes it so popular everywhere in the world. Is it because we just mentioned that it's very hard to brew and to be as clear and as perfect as it is. What makes it's so popular? Is it because it's an old style, or it's just still something that is thirst quenching or easy to find the ingredients?
I think it's a couple. It's definitely a couple different things. One is that at the time when it was invented, it was extremely novel. So you have a clean, bright, clear beer like we had described that was golden, and then that became kind of the new standard for beer, and that was so revolutionary for everybody that just became the default that everybody was looking for when they were getting going for a beer. Now, obviously, that's not the style of brewing that was from the UK, and the UK has its own brewing traditions that are very different from these. So, in places that were colonies of England, I think you would typically find more English style beers in those colonies. But because Pilsner was just so radically different from everything else, the popularity spread pretty quickly and became, if you have the option of drinking some heavy stout or some very like full-bodied ale versus drinking something clean and crisp in a summer month, it's not going to be a very difficult decision when you drink contaminated water or you drink beer that is safe in hundreds of years ago. So So that was the first thing. The second thing was eventually when the Pilsner breweries and the big lager breweries got to be bigger and more powerful and consolidated their power, breweries like Anheuser and Miller and everywhere else, those when those beers became super powerful and those or when those breweries became super powerful, they were vertically integrated. So they owned all of the raw materials, they owned the brewery, they owned all the distributorships, and then they had tied houses too. So the actual bars and taverns that would sell their beer were essentially contractually obligated to only sell their beers. They had corners on the entire market, and so that's when you get to make the rules, you get to own everything. And then they would slowly go around and buy up the regional breweries that and the smaller breweries that were making maybe more unique beers, or maybe they would make a Pilsner, but it would be different, or maybe they would make some other smaller unique beers from maybe they were a neighborhood that had a lot of Czech immigrants, or maybe there were a lot of German immigrants, and they would make the style of beers from their little communities. But that eventually got all pushed out because the big breweries, kind of ate them up or pushed them out of the way and made it so that they couldn't be profitable. And then the other really big important part of this is when Prohibition hit in the U.S., that wiped out everybody. The big breweries were able to hold